Good morning. We're going to get started with our second panel here. It's a great pleasure for me to be able to introduce my new colleague, Sarah Rinfrey, who's going to be moderating the panel. Sarah's brand new here in Missoula. This is her first semester teaching in the political science department. We're just thrilled to have her. She comes to us from Hartwick College in New York, where she taught for several years. Her work and her teaching focuses on regulatory policy, environmental policy, public administration, and American politics. And in particular, she's interested in the interactions between agencies and interest groups during the stages of environmental rulemaking at the federal and state levels. She's new here on campus. This is her debut on the university stage, but she promises to be a great addition to the university community and to the Missoula community. So, Sarah, take it away.
All right, so I have the pleasure of introducing our wonderful panel today. And the focus today is on the next 50 years of wilderness. And so I'm going to start off by introducing our two discussants, Jennifer Ferenstein and Chris Ryan. And so Jennifer is to my right here. She has a bachelor's degree from Reed College and her master's of science degree in environmental studies from the University of Montana. She's had a variety of jobs, including tracking and studying golden eagles, teaching field courses in Alaska, Utah, and Montana, and serving as an environmental policy advisor for the state of Montana. She's also served as the elected president of the Sierra Club, and for the last 10 years, she's worked for the Wilderness Society, running the Rocky Mountain Front campaign. Our second discussant today is Chris Ryan. Chris has spent 35 years working for the U.S. Forest Service, primarily wilderness management positions, starting out as a wilderness ranger in the Alpine Lakes Wilderness in Washington State, and eventually in Montana, where she represented the Forest Service at the Arthur Carhart National Wilderness Training Center. Chris spent the last 12 years of her career as the program manager for the Wilderness, Rivers, and Outfitters and Guides for the northern region of the Forest Service. And since retirement, Chris has kept very busy with numerous boards within Missoula. And then our two presenters today, who I'll hand off here in a moment to, Martin Nye, my colleague from Northern Arizona, also the director of the Bolle Center for People and Forests, and a professor of natural resource policy in the College of Forestry Conservation at the University of Montana. His research and teaching broadly focuses on federal lands and wildlife policy, planning and management, and some of his most recent work is looking at issues surrounding protected lands, federal lands planning, and adaptive management. And his most recent book is The Governance of Western Public Lands, Mapping Its Present and Future. And Martin's co-presenter is Chris Barnes. He came to the Arthur Carhart National Wilderness Training Center in 1999 after serving almost 9 years for the lead wilderness, recreation, and paleontology programs for the Bureau of Land Management's Farmington office in New Mexico. And he also helped to put together the Wilderness Act's 30th anniversary conference and wrote and directed the film American Values, American Wilderness, which has been widely aired on PBS. So this is our panel for today, and Chris and Martin are going to again present information on the next 50 years of wilderness. So thank you, Chris and Martin.
Can you hear me? Yes. What a humbling experience. There is an amazing group of people in this room, and I want to thank all of you for coming. What Chris and I would like to do today, well, it can't be wrong because we're going to talk about the future of wilderness, politics, designation, and management. And in short, what we will argue are that there will be three central factors to pay attention to in understanding the future of wilderness: political polarization, trends in collaboration, and increasing demands to manipulate wilderness areas. And we need to say that Chris is not officially speaking as a BLM representative today. So before proceeding with our analysis, what we'd like to do is just give you a sense of potential wilderness areas. So if we're looking at the future of the wilderness system, what could possibly be designated in the future. And with regards to the Forest Service, we'll begin with roughly 59 million acres of roadless, inventoried roadless areas as managed pursuant to the 2001 roadless rule. What has happened since 2001, we have 2 state-specific roadless rules, one for Idaho covering roughly 9.3 million acres, and a Colorado roadless rule covering 4.2. And there still is quite a bit of legal uncertainty pertaining to the Tongass National Forest and whether or not it will be exempted from the 2001 roadless rule. That has been in legal limbo now for close to 15 years. There are also congressionally designated wilderness study areas, roughly 3.3 million acres, and areas recommended for wilderness by the Forest Service itself, roughly 5 million acres, although that number is likely to change as national forests throughout the country begin the process of revising their forest plans.
As you can tell, we are going to do a tag team thing here. And let's take a look correspondingly to the potential wilderness on the Bureau of Land Management. The Federal Land Policy and Management Act of 1976, Section 603, directed the Bureau to do an inventory of lands with wilderness characteristics, and when we found them, go through a land use planning process, determine which areas were suitable, and protect those so that their wilderness characteristics would remain unimpaired till Congress got around to designating them. After the designations, BLM has 221 wildernesses. We have about 530 WSAs left, actually 528, around 12.8 million acres. We also know, as a result of some court cases in the late 2000s, that wilderness is to be considered like any other resource. And Section 201 of FLPMA says you need to keep your inventories of your resources current. So we now know that we need to do inventories of wilderness characteristics outside our wilderness and wilderness study areas. And in Section 202 of FLPMA, it says you will use the results of those inventories in your land use planning. So we are in the process of going through that at the moment, identifying areas that are not wilderness study areas or wilderness, but nevertheless have wilderness characteristics, and then deciding in land use planning whether or not we're going to protect those wilderness characteristics. In the states, except for Alaska, where BLM manages surface, we expect that there might be somewhere between 5 and 10 million acres of lands with wilderness characteristics that are not already protected in some fashion. In Alaska, there's never been an inventory of in Alaska. ANILCA exempted the BLM from doing an inventory there, and we've had dueling secretarial memos ever since then. As a result of the court case, though, we know that we actually do need to do an inventory in Alaska. It's hard to say how much is going to end up being found to have wilderness characteristics. For example, the National Petroleum Reserve Alaska, NPRA, for those of you who don't know where that is, that's the piece of land just to the west of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. NPRA is 22.8 million acres. The BLM surveyed that for lands with wilderness characteristics and found roughly 22.8 million acres with wilderness characteristics. And in the land use plan, decided to protect about 13.7 million acres of that. When you think about that, if hell were to freeze over and Congress designate that as wilderness, it would be by far the largest unit in the National Wilderness Preservation System. Conversely, Eastern Alaska Field Office, which oddly enough is in Eastern Alaska, identified somewhere between 6 and 7 million acres of lands with wilderness characteristics, and the draft, it's not final yet, the draft suggested that we would preserve none of those acres. So it's really hard to say where we're going to go. I should say where the BLM is going to go, because I'm not speaking for the BLM today. It's hard to know where the BLM is going to go in Alaska.
Well, let's start looking into the future, and we'll begin with what we believe is one of the primary factors that are going to change wilderness politics, designation, and management in the future, and that is extreme political and congressional polarization. And why we are so concerned about Congress, of course, is because it takes an act of Congress to designate wilderness. And what happens to Congress is going to impact the future of the wilderness system. And what has so remarkably changed since 1964 is the degree of political polarization. This is a graph from the recent task force convened by the American Political Science Association that shows that Congress is more polarized now than it has been in more than 100 years. The parties are more distinct, homogenized, and the task force also shows that most of the divergence from the two parties results from the rightward movement of the Republican Party. So as we have seen and expect to see more congressional dysfunction, gridlock, and less compromise and less productivity. What's also interesting to point out is the polarization among the American public. This is from an unprecedented large poll by the Pew Research Center just a couple of months ago that show how polarized the American public actually is. An increasing number of Americans are found in what they call ideological silos. And the party members have, especially the attentive, active party membership, has a growing antipathy towards the other party, actually believing that the other party poses a threat to the nation's welfare.
So we can look at the implications for this in wilderness, and I think nothing better exemplifies this than the actions of the 112th Congress. The 112th Congress was so polarized that it became the only Congress in the last 50 years to actually decrease the size of the National Wilderness Preservation System. It passed only one wilderness piece of legislation, and it took 200 acres out of the Olympic wilderness at the time. Whoops, wrong. Because of this polarization, we see pressure for the use of alternative pathways around Congress. You've heard the President talk about this in a number of different fields, not just natural resource protection, but certainly the national monuments have been used by presidents throughout the past 100 years plus to designate areas without congressional action, and we see that's happened 4 times in the Obama administration. 2 of those designations have wilderness study areas in them that Congress was not going to be designating, at least anytime soon, as wilderness, and so a national monument was declared. The roadless rule that Martin talked about earlier is another way around congressional inaction. And then, of course, there are the opportunities for withdrawals under FLIPMA by the President. All of these have shortcomings to them. The FLIPMA withdrawals are extremely limited in either time or size. The roadless rule, of course, is only roadless. It's not protecting wilderness. And we've seen with the designation of national monuments that there is certainly a level of protection. It's not wilderness, but it also lessens the pressure for there to be wilderness designation in the future.
Well, the second trend we believe is going to impact the future of wilderness management and politics is the growth of collaboration. And we understand that it presents the possibility of breaking open some long-time wilderness droughts and stalemates. But on the other hand, we're also concerned that some of the compromises and concessions made by these collaborative groups in today's polarized political context could possibly undermine and threaten the integrity of the National Wilderness Preservation System. Now, before going down that road, we do want to talk a little bit about why collaboration has grown so much in wilderness politics. And there are two things that I don't think get enough attention. One is, this is simplified, but keep in mind that first-generation wilderness designations were generally low-hanging fruit. High elevation, rocks and ice, alpine sort of environments. And as we look into the future, those roadless lands, for example, we are moving down in topography and into territory that is going to have more pre-existing uses and entrenched political interests associated with them. So the politics of the future is going to be more complicated. Motorized use is another issue that wasn't really discussed back in 1964. A lot of it about automobiles, but not OHVs. And what's important here, I think that there are different ways of looking at this. For some of those groups that are collaborating today in different wilderness bills, look at the incredible growth of motorized use as posing a challenge to future wilderness designation. And they embrace a sort of urgency of getting these places protected, because every year that we fail to protect some of these landscapes, what you're going to see is greater incursions by motorized users into these places, claims of historic use, and that will make wilderness designation more difficult in the future. Consider just over Highway 12, the Lolo Pass on the Clearwater, for example. This comes from the Clearwater travel planning process. And the Clearwater recognized that the growing use of motorized recreation on the Clearwater is not going to work in the favor of future wilderness designation.
So let's take a look at the compromises that have occurred over time in the wilderness context. Of course, we know that there were compromises in the 1964 law. You've heard about those earlier in the conference today. There are subsequent special management provisions that have been inserted. Now, this is not new. The first one was just 5 years after the Wilderness Act. Desolation wilderness was designated with a special provision allowing a hydroelectric power line to go through the wilderness. So that's not new. It's just that there seem to be more and more of these. In the early 2000s, something started creeping up that has commonly been called the quid pro quo aspect of wilderness designation, where there's wilderness designation on one hand, and in the same bill, there's also some kind of economic development. This also is not new. In wilderness legislation in the same bill, going back as far as 1978 with the designation of the Gospel Hump, that bill had this area is going to be set aside as wilderness and this area is going to be logged. I think it even predates that. It just used to be in different bills. There used to be more, this gets back to the polarization, there used to be more trust among members of Congress. So Mo Udall could champion the two great Arizona wilderness bills and also champion the Central Arizona Project, right? He could do both of those, and there was some trust in what was going to happen. I think we see a lot less trust in Congress today. We'll take a look at what we think is a disturbing trend, and that is in the growing number of these special provisions. We're just starting to look at some numbers, and if you take ANILCA out of the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, which has lots of special provisions in it, if you remove that from the equation, the number of special provisions per wilderness designated by each Congress has drastically increased in the last 15 years. And the Forest Jobs and Recreation Act, although it has not yet passed, is a perfect example of this. Now, the references that I'm going to make are from the very first version of the bill. The current version of the bill is somewhat different than this. But look at the unique special provisions that were in that bill. Landing aircraft for military training. Use of motor vehicles to herd sheep. Use of motor vehicles just to check on stock ponds. It grandfathered all outfitter activities, whether or not they conformed to the Wilderness Act of 1964. And it implied that the state had the authority to regulate target shooting in wilderness. Now, none of these, two of these in the most recent version of the bill, two of these have been dropped. The other three have been modified to make them less onerous to wilderness. But my point is, our point is that these 5 provisions were agreed to in a compromise, were agreed to by the conservation organizations that supported this bill. How far will this go in current negotiations? We don't know, but we see some disturbing trends.
Well, Chris alluded to this already, and I'll just go over this quickly, but this work builds on a pretty comprehensive catalog of special provisions by the Congressional Research Service and also the Natural Resources Law Center. And we just want to point out the number of special provisions has increased over time in wilderness law. And the study concludes this way.
Yeah, we see this example of once a special provision gets in, it tends to stay in, and I want to use a very simple example, and that's the one that deals with buffer zones. The original 64 Act had no mention of buffer zones in it. That first appeared in 1980 in the New Mexico Wilderness Act, and here's the language about buffer zones. Congress does not intend for there to be protective perimeters or buffer zones. The fact that a non-wilderness activity can be seen or heard shall not, of itself, preclude such activities or uses up to the boundary. Okay, so just because you can hear or see something, that in and of itself is not enough reason to say no. I keep hitting the wrong button here. By 1984, this appeared in almost every Wilderness Act. But in 2002, the Clark County Act made a different buffer zone language, which is now seen in almost all Wilderness Acts. It broke the previous sentence into 2 parts. All right? 1 is there are no buffer zones, and 2 is seen or heard. A manager is taught, oh, well, there's 2 provisions. This must mean 2 different things. In addition, this law took out the phrase of itself. So what we're left with is a manager reading this is, wow, I can't use sights or sounds at all. And in fact, because there's 2 sections here, apparently I cannot have any influence over anything that happens outside the wilderness boundary. Now, whether or not that's what this actually means is another question. But managers think that way, because I'm told this all the time by managers. And the people that wanted this bill, this language written like this, I think you could say that some of them want managers to think that way. And so we are seeing over time a weakening of the protection of wilderness character through these special provisions that tend to propagate themselves. This is just one example.
And we just want to be clear, like on Wednesday night, we understand that compromise has always been part of the Wilderness Act, and special provisions have long been used. But we want to emphasize that there is a fundamental difference between what we believe are old sets of compromises, which are essentially the release of possible wilderness areas and drawing boundaries, versus this new breed of compromise in which we're talking about how wilderness is to be managed. And as we look into the future, we have some concerns about these quid pro quo deals and essentially trading or treating wilderness as currency for economic development on adjacent federal lands.
The third factor that Martin mentioned at the very beginning of our talk is the increasing demands for manipulation of the wilderness ecosystems. Peter Landers talked about this earlier this morning, and we all have seen that there are an increased demand to manipulate fire on the land, manage insects and disease, invasive species. It sets up what is frequently referred to as this clash between, is the area to be untrammeled or is it to be natural? And we know, in fact, that the area is actually supposed to be both. This is not a versus. This is an unnatural, an untrammeled and natural, but that's not always easy. And there are increasing pressures on managers to make one change or another, particularly over demands to manipulate for things like water supply. Peter mentioned this. We need more water for desert ungulates because it's a desert, and apparently they need more water because they're not used to not having water, even though they're desert animals. And so we build extra guzzlers in Kofa, and apparently the coyotes don't realize that these are for bighorn sheep. They built two, and there were some cameras put up, and I looked at a year's worth of pictures on both these guzzlers that were put up, 11,300 pictures I looked at, and there were like 470 pictures of coyotes, and there were 75 pictures of bobcats, and there were 6 pictures of mountain lions, and there were 2 pictures of bighorn sheep. I'm not a biologist, but I'm thinking you want to have more bighorn sheep stop providing water for their predators. That's just me. In addition, there's been talk of manipulating wilderness ecosystems for creating water supply for non-wilderness purposes. Just a couple of years ago, I was surprised to see the testimony from the Deputy Chief of the Forest Service, who was testifying against a provision in a wilderness bill in Colorado that would have removed presidential authority to create new water diversions in wilderness. Those of you who might not know, the Wilderness Act of '64 has a clause that allows the president to authorize water diversions without congressional approval. This bill in Colorado, as many of the Colorado bills, removed that presidential authority. And the deputy chief testified against this, while at the same time suggesting that we might want to increase the capacity of dams over 10,000 feet in elevation so that there'd be more water later in the runoff, later in the year for runoff. So I was kind of surprised. Here's the deputy chief in this administration arguing against a provision that would strengthen wilderness and in favor of a provision that would weaken wilderness. There are also, of course, demands to manipulate for the cause du jour. In this case, sage grouse is one of the ones that's popular at the moment. There is a provision, or a proposal, I should say, in the Owyhee Canyons wilderness in southwestern Idaho to treat, we don't know exactly what treat means yet because just in the scoping phase, to treat 230,000 acres of wilderness to remove juniper to the benefit of sage grouse. 230,000 acres for sage grouse. We'll come back to that in a minute.
So, is wilderness an idea whose time has come and gone? We'd ask you to consider the language in the law. And we italicize these provisions for you to consider what's happened with population, for example, as referenced by Peter Landris this morning. Consider the unbelievable expansion of settlement in the West and projections for the future. Forest Service has provided these images for dozens of cities across the western United States. Flagstaff in 1959, 1978, 2002. Consider growing mechanization that's happened since 1964, the incredible rise of motorized vehicle use. And we'll leave it to the writers and the poets and the philosophers in the room to talk about the importance of future generations. And it's for those reasons why we believe that wilderness is more important in 2014 than it was in 1964. It provides that transcendent anchor, as Marianne was talking about this morning. And it's not really too much to ask when we consider the larger context. 5% of the United States designated as wilderness. Take Alaska out of the equation and it's 2.7%. Consider that most of the country has been transformed by agricultural and urban landscapes. Most of the remaining lands networked with roads. Marianne and Peter talked about this, the whole panel this morning. Wilderness was never meant to be some panacea for conservation. But we believe that it's vital in protecting values that are increasingly rare in modern society. We'll also have you consider if all we want to do is ban oil field development or restrict motorized use, if those are the more limited set of conservation objectives, then we have a menu of other policy options. National monuments, national recreation areas, national conservation areas. But when we want to protect places as wilderness, you have to use the Wilderness Act to do so.
I want to close out with something that a piece of legislation that Congress passed 25 years ago, honoring Clinton Anderson, senator from New Mexico, who's one of the Senate floor leaders on this bill. And the piece of legislation quoted one of Anderson's speeches. The spiritual value to conservation. Come back to that anchor again. Wilderness is an anchor to the windward. We are still a rich nation. Can you imagine Congress passing a piece of legislation with this language in it today? So what we're saying is we need these areas, and that means that we need to push back against this tide of compromising away the very essence of wilderness. We want wildernesses to be wilderness, right, that follow the Wilderness Act, not getting diluted so that we have areas that are wilderness in name only, which we refer to as winos. And as mentioned in the earlier panel, we have to resist this urge to garden as if that we always knew what was best for the land. If we approach these areas as wilderness with that humility, then what we will end up with is real wilderness. And as we've said, we need that real wilderness more now than ever before. Ooh. Thank you.
Martin and Chris, and what we're going to do next is Chris, Ryan, and Jennifer each have a question, and then we hope to open it up to the audience as well. So Chris has a first set of questions for Martin and Chris.
Okay, thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Chris and Martin. Really, really appreciate the comments that you made and just your real thorough thoughts on this topic. And I can say that I don't necessarily disagree with anything that you've said, but I am really interested in us working on solutions instead of continuing to identify the problems. And here's why, is because in Montana, we have 6 million acres of unprotected roadless lands and on national forests. And in northern Idaho, we have an additional 3 million acres. And these areas are not small remnants of unroaded areas that are between congressionally designated wilderness and roads. These are whole mountain ranges. We're talking about the Sapphires, the Great Burn, the Scotchman Peaks, the Rocky Mountain Front, the Swan Range, the Big Snowies, the East Pioneers, the Snowcrest. And the list goes on and on and on. Some people would call these low-hanging fruit. But unfortunately, we have not had an acre of wilderness designated in this state in 31 years. These areas are not only incredibly beautiful and magnificent, but they also could fill really significant gaps in the congressionally designated wilderness system that we have in this region right now, both ecologically as well as socially. So again, you know, we haven't had an acre designated in 31 years. So over the past probably half a dozen years, conservation groups in this region have been getting together with other interests, the timber industry, snowmobilers, mountain bikers, and ranchers, to come up with creative solutions to try to find long-term protection for these areas. And the creative solutions have been in the form of bills, and Chris mentioned one of them, Senator Tester's bill. And unfortunately, what these bills have done is they have provided legislative assurances for wilderness as well as for other resources and interests. Unfortunately, there hasn't been widespread support for this approach by other conservation groups. And so what I would like to see is for conservation groups, rather than opposing each other, I would really like to see them band together, because I think that our long-term goal is the same, that we would really like to see long-term protection for these areas that are so worthy of being included in the National Wilderness Preservation System. And so with that said, I would like to ask Chris and Martin, first of all, if they have any thoughts that they would like to add to what I've said about our situation here in this region, but also, more importantly, what basic principles do you think conservation groups should agree to when collaborating with other interests that will bring the various interests to the table, but also keep us at the table? So,
Your name's first on the paper, Martin.
So unfair a question. We were given these questions or forms of these questions in advance, and they were so amazingly good. Chris and I met in my office for about 2 hours, and we had a really good time talking about all this stuff. And I left that meeting more confused than when we got the questions. And it's such a cop-out. I'm still sorting a lot of this out in my head. What's going on in the Clearwater Nez Perce right now, for example. So I want to reserve judgment on some of these more specific issues. But you know, I think when collaboration works best as a sort of principle is when it can be used to facilitate or more efficiently and effectively implement existing environmental laws and processes. When collaboration gets into trouble is when it is viewed as undermining those bedrock environmental laws. And what we're going to see in the future, beginning with the Clearwater Nez Perce, and I believe as we're going to see in the next 10 years as national forest plans get revised throughout the West, are different sets of expectations. So you have the Clearwater Basin Collaborative, right, for example, that came up with a pretty remarkable consensus agreement. And where things will get interesting is where that consensus agreement presses up against NEPA, the participatory planning processes that were already used in travel planning, in the writing of the revised plan. So there's a bit of a mismatch there. And I think the intersection of all of these collaborations and existing decision-making processes is going to be a tough one to figure out. And I hope you don't see that as a cop-out. I just don't really, I'm still sorting some of this out in my head, going through the Clearwater Nez Perce materials. Yeah, so there.
I think the problem that you have identified, Chris, is not restricted to here. If you look across the West, certainly, I think the only state that has anything close to a complete, and it's only close, it's not complete, suite of wildernesses is the state of Arizona. And even there, they can't figure out what to do with the Grand Canyon. It's not designated because no one wants to make a compromise over what happens with the river corridor. So it's a definite problem. But I would say, to answer your question, the two things that I would say to the conservation communities: first thing, no more special provisions. Okay? We've had the special provisions. They're in the '64 Act. We don't need any others. If you can't get the area designated as wilderness because you need to have these other special provisions, what you're really wanting is an area that's not wilderness. You want something else. So I would say that's number one. Number two, something I heard the previous Lolo Forest supervisor say in a conference about the Forest Jobs and Wilderness Act, and that is involve the federal land management agencies earlier in the process. Now, I'm not a Forest Service person. I don't know how, for a long time, the Forest Jobs and Recreation Act was only a Forest Service Act. And I remember going to public meetings and, going to the MWA person and afterwards and go, oh, there's BLM. You got BLM, BLM. And, one of the people who was behind the scenes working on this, I was, spouting out BLM, and that person said, Chris, please don't make this any more difficult than it already is. And it made me think that some people were more interested in getting a bill done than in getting the right bill done. And finally, the BLM was asked. The field manager said, here are your wilderness study areas in the area. Are these still your recommendations? That was the extent of the consultation. And of course, what could the manager say other than, well, yeah, there are recommendations. 2 years ago, Bob Abbey testified before Congress. Yeah, we made those recommendations back in 1991. If we made them today, they'd be completely different. None of that was taken into account. So I would say those two things.
I'd say one thing, just from working on the Rocky Mountain Front Heritage Act. On the ground, when we started talking about the front and the public lands, BLM and Forest Service lands, we started with principles. It was a place-based bill, but we went into it from people from very different perspectives, both politically and just sort of where they are in their lives and the values that they have. And we started talking about what are the core principles that we are going to agree to. And they were basically, for the folks that we talked to, they were about ecological integrity and protecting the values on the land, and in this case, traditional values. And there isn't a lot of motorized use on the Rocky Mountain front. So in some ways, that wasn't a huge issue for us. And so what I found was that when we spent more time talking about the principles and the values, and instead of immediately jumping to maps and to designations, then we started coming up with what I think most people believe makes sense. And I think that's a good place to be. I don't believe in the Heritage Act, the way it's written, that it compromises wilderness. There's not as much wilderness in the bill as some people might like. There's not as much as the Forest Service recommends. But we sort of, I think, took the approach you're suggesting, which is that there were a lot of non-conforming uses on some of the land based on both grazing and clearing trails with chainsaws and the like. So we tried to deal with those non-conforming uses by talking to the people up front and coming up with a holistic plan where every acre is protected. There's a core of 5 wilderness additions to the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex, and then the rest is in this designation we call the Conservation Management Area designation. But I think it is possible to get it on the ground. But I think principles to places is different than principles to a process, like trying to resolve how to deal with WSAs, wilderness study areas, will be a larger public dialogue across the state. It will not be done on I don't think you can do it so much on a place-based way.
Well, Jennifer, I think groups across the West have a lot to learn from your leadership on the Front Act. because you've managed to put forward, I think, a very straightforward, old-fashioned wilderness bill with none of the special provisions that Chris and I are talking about. And packaging a wilderness area with a conservation management area has been done for a long time. So we're not talking about the Rocky Mountain Front Act at all.
No, but I think the idea of coming to principles would keep us out of some trouble, I think.
Well, I guess I would like to add just a little bit to my own question, and that is something that I learned when I was actually working for the Forest Service in the regional office here in Missoula when the Forest Protection Act, Senator Tester's bill, was being written. And I was so naive. I had never been involved in writing a wilderness bill before. And even though I had been involved in trying to manage a wilderness bill or manage lands from a wilderness bill, I was so naive that when Senator Tester's staff sent me the bill, I actually filed it and then put it on track changes and thought, yeah, I get to rewrite this bill. And I completely rewrote that bill and then handed it over to them and realized that that wasn't my job, that I wasn't really supposed to be rewriting their bill. But the thing that I found really disturbing was that I think they started with, rather than starting with our situation here in Montana and just building what we needed to from the '64 Act, they started with either an Arizona Act or a California Act that had a lot of things in it that I didn't think we needed and that I thought would cause problems here in Montana. And so I guess that what I would suggest is that conservation groups make sure that when a bill is written, that it's written from the 1964 Act and not from an act from another state that has a lot of extraneous stuff that isn't going to be applicable. But I have one quick follow-up, and I'm sure this will be really quick, follow-up question, because one of the things that really had people had a hard time with in Senator Tester's bill was the the legislative assurance for the timber industry as well as for mountain bikers and snowmobilers for that matter. And so what I wanted to ask you two is, do you think it's unreasonable for others, such as the timber industry and mountain bikers, to want legislative assurance?
I told Chris, my goal was to get out of today without having to talk about Tester's bill. That's where I set the bar. I have argued with so many people in this room for...
There's so many wonderful areas to be designated wilderness in that bill.
Yeah, I hunt in those areas, and so I have mixed feelings. I opposed that legislation for multiple reasons, the most important of which was the mechanical treatment mandate that I thought set a very dangerous precedent, not only for wilderness management and law, but for federal lands law in general. And if anything, my position is only hardened over the last few years. When you consider Doc Hastings' bill that also has what is essentially a timber harvest volume mandate, when you consider the recent amendment by John McCain to the Flame Act, which has a mechanical treatment mandate, wanting the same thing, but they want it nationwide. So my position hasn't changed in that regard. Is it reasonable for industry to want that mandate and bikers to want certainty? No, it's not unreasonable. It's unreasonable to give it to them. When it comes to bikes or motorized use, they can, I think the pursuit of certainty is what drives most federal land politics. So it's not unreasonable. And bikes and motorized users can get that certainty in the designation of a conservation area. Now, when it comes to the timber industry, I understand that need as well. I mean, you need long-term commitments and investments. I'm sympathetic, for example, to Cordy Sanders and Pyramid and what they're trying to do. And so I understand the need for stability and certainty in that marketplace. I think they can get that certainty by using other policy options, long-term stewardship contracts or what have you, that you're not going to find it in a piece of legislation. And if you look at the history of Alaska's timber harvest mandate, ANILCA, the Tongass Timber Reform Act, the Quincy Library Group legislation, it didn't go as planned.
I can't say anything that Martin didn't say.
Well, I think we're going to shift our focus to the role of science, and then I do want to leave some time for the audience, too. I know some of my students are here, so they can ask questions today. So,
Well, I'm going to trick you guys and not ask my first question. Well, just because there's something you said that I hadn't thought of before, and I just want to bring it up. It probably won't take too long, but you talked about not wanting to sweeten the pot with economic incentives and add them into a wilderness bill necessarily, or that you have to be careful about that. But I just wanted to push back a little bit and say that there are a lot of communities, rural communities, that do struggle and are trying to keep their livelihoods intact and some of those traditional uses. And I was just curious if you did see that maybe there was room to explore innovative ways to couple protections, permanent land protections, with incentives that are not counterproductive to land protection, but complementary to that, or potentially doing something like rewarding counties for the amount of land that they have in their county that they would designate as wilderness, a sort of change in the PILT structure, the payment in lieu of taxes or secure rural schools. It doesn't seem to me to be a bad thing to explore economic incentives to bring more people into the tent for wanting to protect these lands.
I absolutely agree, especially your latter point about readjusting PILT formulas and secure schools. You know, the work of Ray Rasker at Headwaters Economics has been pushing this, and I completely support it. I guess where I have a problem with it, when you package some of those extraneous economic development provisions in a wilderness law. And you can see it's unfolding now at even a larger scale in Utah, and Bishop's so-called Representative Bishop's grand bargain in Utah, where wilderness is being treated as this currency for a whole range of issues, the possible privatization of federal lands, road claims, oil and gas development. I think when we start going down that road, I get uncomfortable.
And because I'm a wilderness geek, I'm mostly concerned with when that economic development impinges upon wilderness designation in ways beyond that which is authorized under the '64 Wilderness Act. So, you know, recently, you know, the conservation groups that negotiated the Oahe Canyonlands bill came back to the BLM saying, please let rancher X use ATVs and motorcycles to herd his cows, because that's what we promised him when we negotiated this bill. That's not wilderness. You know, you did not negotiate a wilderness. You negotiated a place called wilderness. And I object to that. Outside of wilderness, that's Martin's area. I'm inside wilderness. Do not do that, please.
do you have any last follow-up?
Sure. Well, I'm just going to skip to my last, which was my follow-up question. So you guys are, I'm going to send you back in time to 1964. You're going to be sitting at the table with Zonheiser and others, and you are going to be a framer. But you're going to have your knowledge of what you know today with the challenges and the opportunities looking forward. Would you change? What would you change about the Wilderness Act? Would you write something different? Would you take something out? Would you make it easier to create wilderness? What would you do?
I would ban spandex. Chris?
I'm going to give a somewhat more measured that question. There are two things. I would, if I could, And of course, it couldn't happen. But I wish Section 4D7 was different, the section on water rights. I wish the Wilderness Act gave the wilderness areas supremacy over state water law. Wilderness Act wouldn't have passed if it had that language in it, but I wish that it happened. It would have made things so much easier, so much better for wilderness, particularly in the arid Southwest. The one thing I think that could have been helped was clarifying Section 4D8, the section on wildlife, which is, I don't think it was meant to be misleading, but it certainly has been interpreted misleadingly by managers. The section says that nothing in the Wilderness Act changes the authority of the states to manage fish and wildlife. And our managers think that means, oh, the states have the authority to manage fish and wildlife, when in fact they don't. That is a federal authority on federal land. The states only get to manage fish and wildlife up to the point with where what they want to do conflicts with federal law, regulation, or policy. And in wilderness, there might be those conflicts. And we have a lot of managers. Gosh, you could only have to go back to last winter in the Frank Church. The managers going, oh, there's nothing we can do. The states manage wildlife. It's just not true. And I wish the act had been a little more clear in that.
It would have been interesting to have a definition of road. That would have changed some things, the trajectory of wilderness politics. That provision was added.
So now we'd like to open up to the audience. If anyone has questions, we could get at least 3 or 4 questions in before our time is up today.
Well, we obviously have well-informed people in front of us, so I got a good question that I don't think's been addressed. We have 3 branches of government: legislative, executive, and judicial. What about the court system? Has it been a help or a hindrance to wilderness? In Yellowstone, for example, the court system often got involved with wolf reintroduction and so forth. What about courts and wilderness? Normally the Supreme Court is thought to be conservative. They're not an elected body. They ought to be able to think long range, maybe, in ways that other branches of government can't. What about the judicial system and wilderness?
Well, I am not a lawyer, but I played one on TV. Sorry. The younger people in the crowd might not get that allusion. I don't know. But I think on the whole, the courts have been very favorable to wilderness. My reference to the federal management of wildlife stems from the Kleppe v. New Mexico case, which was a 9-0 Supreme Court decision. This is not one of those narrowly split decisions. And a few years ago, Peter Appel from the University of Georgia did some research looking at wilderness cases and found that in general, when the plaintiff said that the federal agency was being too protective of wilderness, the plaintiff lost 60% of the cases. And when the plaintiff said that the federal government was not being protective enough of wilderness, the plaintiff won something like 80% of the cases. So it seems that the courts take wilderness preservation at least as serious, if not more seriously, than the executive branch.
I'm Tim Faber. I've been involved in wilderness in the Upper Missouri River Breaks National Monument. Chris and Martin, you talked about inventorying of wilderness land, and Congress has been intensely opposed to any further inventorying or re-inventorying of public lands. I was involved in the inventory process of the Cow Creek Wilderness Study Area in the Upper Missouri River Breaks, and one of the criticisms was its proximity to 2 ranching operations and the lights from the Landusky Zortman mines. those operations no longer exist. Those wilderness characteristics have changed. The Highline inventory has just been completed. The BLM completed their Highline Resource Management Plan last year, a couple of years ago, and they documented some of the wilderness characteristics despite the shelving of Secretarial Order 3310. You're familiar with that?
Yeah.
And from my understanding, that order, it was intended to inventory public lands for multiple uses, not just wilderness, and in the prioritization of those uses, it said, under my understanding, that just because a certain value had high value, it could not trump those other values. Am I correct on that?
Yes, so the Secretarial Order 3310 was in response to these court cases that started in Oregon that said we need to do these inventories. And I think the difference between 3310, which was rescinded, it was 3310 and the Endangered Species Act were the two wounds to conservation from the 2011 budget bill. 3310 said that after you do your inventory, we will put our thumb on the scale so that there are two parts to this. I'm sorry, I'm taking a little too long on this. There are two parts to this. One is inventory, which is more or less objective, and then there is the decision on how to manage that land after our inventory, which is completely subjective. That is a public process. 3310 said we're going to put our thumb on the scale of the side of protecting wilderness characteristics, and that has been removed, that we don't do that anymore. We look, does it have wilderness characteristics? Then yes, it has wilderness characteristics. Okay, are we going to protect those wilderness characteristics for the life of the land use plan, which is generally 15 to 20 years, or are we not going to protect those wilderness characteristics? So you saw from my Alaska example, one office decided to protect 13.7 of the 22.8 million acres, and the other office decided with public input. This is not something that the BLM does in the cubicles of their own office, decided not to protect any. So, did I answer your question? Okay, good.
Do you have any other responses?
I have a question kind of in response, or in respect to keeping diverse interests at the table without allowing special provisions necessarily, and that's, how do you feel about the strategy of building in sunset clauses for special provisions? Recognizing that I come from Nilka, which is the land of special provisions, and I've seen the damage, but I also recognize that you wouldn't get a lot of things passed without them. Do you feel like that would be a good way to kind of mitigate the knee-jerk reaction of those groups and kind of isolate that one issue and then put the burden of proof on them later with a sunset clause, or do you think that'd be allowing an unwarranted kind of toe in the door?
Well, as a policy mechanism, I don't have a problem with sunsets. It depends on the exact resource and context or value that it's attached to, I suppose. I'd be wary of them. I mean, Congress is great at doing, or used to be good at doing things and passing things, not so good at removing or adapting those laws, sort of demosclerosis, as political scientists have called it. Be cautious about them. But how they're applied, I would need more details. Yeah.
It has been used. I think there are a number of Park Service wildernesses that have those, this area will become wilderness without further act of Congress when what happens there goes away. The BLM has had one as well, the Elkhorn Wilderness in California. This area, the BLM's going to do a bunch of stuff here. It was mostly some restoration. And when it's done, it will become wilderness, or in 5 years, it will become wilderness, whichever comes first. But I would agree with Martin. It could be used, but we need to be careful with it.
Thank you all. It's a wonderful panel. It's a great opportunity for this discussion. I've been advocating in North Idaho for wilderness in northwestern Montana for 10 years now, and our conversations are largely around building consensus, but I can tell you that we could gather every environmentalist in both states lined up in favor of a bill, and it would not alter or change the political landscape, at least in Idaho. Our delegation needs to see more than that. They need to see support from a lot more people. The way to get them there in some cases is this form of compromise or consolidation of other interests. It's also been 30-plus years since we've seen a bill in either state. It's really clear without that we won't have another wilderness bill. At least to me it seems very clear. Or perhaps a very isolated instance here and there that are rare. So faced with that and the suggestion of using other tools, it seems there are very few other tools in the toolbox. The idea of a national monument is so politically anathemic to our area. It should be applied only sparingly. It will only be applied sparingly, which would leave a lot of lands in limbo. It begs the question, I think, of is it time to talk about let's open the Pandora's box and not call it wilderness light, but codifying some special management areas under some new name that provide for some of the same resource protections, so withdrawal from timber or withdrawal from mining, but managing in a uniform way, perhaps, some of those most pertinent questions of recreation, whether it's motorized or mountain bike. Would you be in favor, if you could be at the table and helping to design such a law, of codifying some system like that, and what would it look like?
What an amazing question, Phil. Yeah, I mean, as I understand it, yes, I think that's one of our recommendations, that these alternative conservation designations are very appropriate and can be individually tailored to meet some of these local needs. Now, are you envisioning some sort of national set of standards, a new system that these...
Rather than a hodgepodge of a dozen different approaches to a so-called special management area, something that has a uniform bearing that could be held up in court, that could be determined in a uniform way that would accommodate enough of the other interests that we'd see progress forward in putting areas into management, conservation management.
Yeah, for those of you who couldn't hear what he was saying, that yes, we're talking about something nationally codified that would be managed across the nation the same way, but could bring in some diverse interests who are not necessarily going to support wilderness designation. Did I get that right, Phil? Yeah. Yeah.
And I guess I would say that I wouldn't disagree with that. And, you know, there are many, many different designations that have already been used that are currently on the books. But I don't want to lose sight of the fact that some of these areas, including Scotchman Peaks, should be in the National Wilderness Preservation System. And so I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I don't want to give up on adding these areas that are so worthy of wilderness designation. I don't want to give up on adding them to the system. So would I be okay with calling maybe, you know, looking at a different designation for say an area like the Highlands where the military wanted to land helicopters? Yeah, I would consider that. But some areas, like I said, they're low-hanging fruit. They should have been wilderness 30 years ago, so, or 50 years ago. So I think it's just one of the tools in the toolbox.
And I think the other thing I would say kind of rankles me when we get caught in the consensus. I mean, if consensus means everybody agrees, I mean, everybody in the whole state or everybody here or everybody there, that's a trap that we can never get out of. I mean, you're never going to get 100% agreement. We all know that. And what I hear from ranchers and people on the front is an incredible frustration with our politicians. And this is where I think the issue of accountability or the way we vote or the way we participate in democracy comes in, is that, you know, locals can work on local solutions for a long, 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 long time and get a majority or get a number of people at the table or solve as many problems as they have heard come up over the years. And then it can go to Washington, D.C. They don't get a consensus on anything. It's a majority vote. And a part of me is like, let's have some up or down votes on some of these individual proposals rather than being defined by consensus as the litmus test, because the politicians don't get held to the consensus standard in Washington, D.C. Why should we in Montana be held to that same standard? That's unfair and unrealistic.
All right, I think we have time for one more question and then some concluding thoughts from our panel.
First of all, Martin, I want to say that I really enjoyed your book, so it's great. Did I hear you say that it would help if we had a definition of road?
After the spandex comment.
Yeah, because one thing I've been surprised about in the conference is that nobody's mentioned Paul Sutter's book, Driven Wild, and we've mentioned the word roadless like countless times, and the point that Sutter makes is that roadlessness comes out of a specific historical moment when he has these amazing statistics, but one of them is that in 1906 there were 10,000 registered cars. In 1922 there were 10 million. And so the response of Leopold and Marshall and those early wilderness forefathers and hopefully mothers, there were some there too, but was this anxiety over consumption that had to do with the car, with the automobile, when people were getting in their cars and driving to purchase things. And that the roadlessness has never really been rethought. It's just like this thing we assume without questioning and thinking of it critically. So I just wanted to hear you say a little bit more about that.
I thought more about the spandex issue than that was an afterthought. The Paul Sutter book is fantastic. I just think maybe it's put myself in a trap here. It certainly would have changed the dynamics of the roadless inventories if Congress would have defined roads. So I'm thinking of the 2477 battles in Utah and elsewhere. It certainly would have put some lawyers out of work. Yeah. I haven't thought it out enough to give you an appropriate response other than that.
There is a House report that talks about roadless that was associated with FLIPMA, because one of the things the BLM had to look at was what, at roadless areas of 5,000 acres or greater. And in many BLM lands, the line of what is a road and what is not a road, because it's so open to cross-country vehicle use, it's much broader than it might be in a forested area. So the House report said that a road has been constructed and maintained for relatively continuous vehicular use. A route that is established simply by the passage of vehicles is not a road. It's a House report. It's not law. It would have helped if Congress was a little more definite in a law and said, this is what we mean. These things are not in wilderness. These kinds of things can be in wilderness.
And I don't know if there is any word in the entire dictionary that the Forest Service has argued over more than what is a road. Yeah, it's one of the reasons I retired. I just couldn't come up with the definition.
Well,
Couldn't get anybody to agree with my definition.
Any final thoughts from our panel today?
I'll say one thing. Besides the fact that it sometimes seems like a downer, that there's more polarization and all these things, I have to say that I am optimistic that there will be wilderness in Montana. And I think one of the main reasons that there will be is that the people are coming to the table. And the merits of some of the proposals are questionable, but it's a constant education process. Where do fires start? How are they fought? How does wilderness affect those? We've had so many discussions over the years just on the front, and we have changed people's opinions and values, and we as conservation organizations have put ourselves on the line to stand by people in those communities, to come up with ways to protect their interests, to keep the Wilderness Act whole. And so I am positive. I think it just seems like a no-brainer that if we could get over some of these wilderness battles that consume a huge amount of people's time and energy and resources, there's so many other things that we need to do with our time to protect our public lands that we do agree on, invasive weeds. And what I tell people in Teton County when I go up there is, if we could work on this proposal, get it done, get it passed, that same energy that we're all sort of pouring into this discussion could be translated into a commitment to improving your economic situations or fighting those weeds. Or, you know, it's a sink that if we could stop discussing it and mulling it over and over again, there's so much we can work on together. And so I'm optimistic that with leadership and discussion that we will get wilderness in the state. And we'll break that drought, and we will be able to move on, and we can show that it is not a bipartisan divide that can't be transcended.
Thank you, everyone, for coming today, and a special thanks to our panelists, and there's some good refreshments, too, so thank you.